Okay, today I'm going to talk about Platonic anamnesis. I'm going to stay away from the Christian or psychological anamnesis. So this is primarily focused on philosophy. All right, so an amnesiac is a person who can't recall, right? So anamnesis is basically the opposite. The word means to remember or to recall, and it's sometimes called psychic recollection, or the doctrine of recollection, or reminiscence. Plato mentions it in his dialogues, Meno and Phaedo, and he also alludes to it in Phaedrus. And it's basically this. It's the idea that humans possess innate knowledge, possibly acquired before birth, and that learning consists of rediscovering that knowledge from within. So it's kind of like when an amnesiac remembers their personality or something about their previous life. This is similar, but it's about your eternal life, not just this physical life. In Neo-Platonism describes it as a trauma that causes the soul to forget its experiences, and often its divine origins as well. So they're basically saying that when you experience birth, you basically become an amnesiac, and through anamnesis you start recovering what you already knew. So one way to look at this is the analogy of like a light switch. So if you think about our eternal life as a light switch, and our physical life is like the light turned on, and our death is like the light turned off. If you see it that way, then you realize that both polarities are part of the same thing. So one is not better or more sought after than the other, they're just in balance. So even though those two things keep changing, the switch still exists, and the switch, I guess, would be like the soul. And so as you bounce back and forth between the two, there are changes that occur. So with that in mind, Plato discusses anamnesis in his book Meno, and Plato's character Socrates is challenged by Meno with what has become known as the sophistic paradox, or the paradox of knowledge. Meno says, "And how are you going to search for the nature of virtue when you don't know at all what it is, Socrates? Which of all the things you don't know will you set up as target for your search? And even if you actually come across it, how will you know that it is that thing which you don't know?" In other words, one who knows none of the attributes, properties, and or other descriptive markers of any kind that helps signify what something is, physical or otherwise, will not recognize it even after coming across it. Therefore, if the converse is true, and one knows the attributes, properties, and or other descriptive markers of this thing, one should not need to seek it out at all. The conclusion is that in either instance, there is no point trying to gain that something. In the case of Plato's aforementioned work, there is no point in seeking knowledge. Socrates' response is to develop his theory of anamnesis and to suggest that the soul is immortal and repeatedly incarnated. Knowledge is in the soul from eternity, but each time the soul is incarnated, its knowledge is forgotten in the trauma of birth. What one perceives to be learning, then, is the recovery of what one has forgotten. Once it has been brought back, it is true belief to be turned into genuine knowledge by understanding. Socrates in Plato thus sees himself not as a teacher, but as a midwife, aiding with the birth of knowledge that was already there in the student. The theory is illustrated by Socrates asking a slave boy questions about geometry. At first, the boy gives the wrong answer. When that is pointed out to him, he is puzzled, but by asking questions, Socrates helps him to reach the correct answer. That is intended to show that since the boy was not told the answer, he reached the truth by only recollecting what he had once known but later forgotten. So basically, the teacher is like a midwife, and they draw out the knowledge from the student. And I think this can happen obviously with people, but it can also happen in other ways. One way would be another ancient Greek idea, and that's the concept of the daemon, which is a guiding spirit or a deity that tutors you. And obviously later, the Christians twisted this word into demon, but what it actually means is the provider or divider of fortunes or destinies. So Plato says that a daemon exists within a person from birth, and each individual gains it by chance. In Plato's Symposium, the priestess Diotima teaches Socrates that love is not a deity, but rather a great daemon. She goes on to explain that everything demonic is between divine and mortal, and she describes daemons as interpreting and transporting human things to the gods and divine things to men. Entreaties and sacrifices from below, and ordinances and requitals from above. In Plato's Apology of Socrates, Socrates claimed to have a daemonion, literally a divine something, that frequently warned him in the form of a voice against mistakes, but never told him what to do. The Platonic Socrates, however, never refers to the daemonion as a daemon. It was always referred to as an impersonal something or sign. Okay, so with that in mind, I'm going to tell you a little story. And it starts like this. Back in college, I was in a relationship with a woman. And I guess it was my second year of college, and we were having problems, so we eventually broke up. Because school was so expensive, I had money issues because I had to pay for my tuition, but I also had to move out and find a new apartment and things. Anyway, I got into a lot of trouble, and I ended up at a hotel, living in a hotel, and I started running out of food. This seems a bit extreme, but it was just the circumstances at the time. So I started running out of food, and I started rationing what I had left, and eventually I ran out. And I knew that if I ate, I was going to have to spend more money, but I needed the money for an apartment, so I stopped eating. So I went into a fasting state. So in this hotel room, I'm fasting and going through this like post-breakup catharsis, and I went through this kind of metamorphosis. It's very hard to put into words, but as I was further away from food, the longer, I started hearing a voice, I guess. And the only way I could think of to kind of articulate the voice was through, like, I've seen talking boards in the past. Like one form would be like the Ouija board. But what I did is I had a piece of paper and I wrote the alphabet on it, and I started having a communication with this voice. And I mean, I guess it could have been starvation that was bringing this on. I don't know. It could have also been fate. Anyway, as it continued, I was basically instructed to stay in the hotel room and keep fasting. So it didn't seem like the best idea at the time, and it was probably a major mistake because a lot was at stake. I mean, if I failed, you know, I would have probably gotten kicked out of school. You know, there was just a lot. So I kept going despite my better judgment, and I ended up not eating for several weeks, and I kind of wasted away a little bit, and you know, over the course of these few weeks I learned probably more about myself than I had ever learned in my life, and it's kind of hard to relate what this other side of me taught me, but it primarily spoke in riddles, and the riddles the thing would challenge me. Like, for example, it would put me into these situations where it like said like the FBI was coming. Sounds pretty crazy. But at the time it seemed kind of logical because I left this woman's apartment and I was into a lot of strange things, and you know, it wouldn't have been out of the realm of possibility for her to like misunderstand what I was doing and, you know, go from there. So at the time I believed what this thing was telling me, but it was basically making me go through this ordeal to face fear, I guess. And I mean, there's way more to the story, but I detail it in my first novel, The Invisible Histories of the Spiral Mountain. There's a few chapters about it. The link is in the description. But suffice it to say, it changed my life. And I did get through it. I remained in school. And it taught me a key piece in the idea of occultism. And ever since that day, it's helped me trust the universe more, I think. Any kind of danger that comes my way or some kind of ordeal that I'm in, I sort of feel like something is watching over me. And I'm not the only person that's had this happen, obviously. The science fiction writer Philip K. Dick also went through a similar experience. He wrote a whole book about it called The Exegesis of Philip K. Dick. It's actually journals that they published after his death, but it happened between February and March of 1974, and he called his experience 2374, and it's referenced in many of his novels. So what happened is Dick had his two impact impacted wisdom teeth pulled. So he was in a great deal of pain. A delivery person from the pharmacy brought his pain medication. When he opened the door, he noticed an ichthus necklace. That's like the Vesica Pisces symbol, the fish. He asked the woman about the meaning, and she said it was a symbol used by the early Christians, and that's when his anamnesis began. In that instant, as I stared at the gleaming fish sign and heard her words, I suddenly experienced what I later learned is called anamnesis, a Greek word meaning literally loss of forgetfulness. I remembered who I was and where I was. In an instant, in the twinkling of an eye, it all came back to me. And not only could I remember it, but I could see it. The girl was a secret Christian, and so was I. We lived in fear of detection by the Romans. We had to communicate with cryptic signs. She had just told me all this, and it was true. For a short time, as hard as this is to believe or explain, I saw fading into view the black, prison-like contours of hateful Rome. But of much more importance, I remembered Jesus, who had just recently been with us and had gone temporarily away and would very soon return. My emotion was one of joy. We were secretly preparing to welcome him back. It would not be long, and the Romans did not know. They thought he was dead, forever dead. That was our great secret, our joyous knowledge. Despite all appearances, Christ was going to return, and our delight and anticipation were boundless. So if you want to know more about his experience, I would definitely check out the Exegesis of Philip K. Dick. It's an amazing book, and it really breaks down the difficulties of a spiritual experience. Like I said, I mean, it's really hard for me to articulate what happened to me in that hotel room, but I think what happened to Philip K. Dick and myself are very similar, because those two moments in our lives informed everything we did from that point forward. And there's really no going back. Before I go, I want to relate one more quick experience that I had recently that is tied to this. So I met this person last year that was very in tune with this kind of idea about connecting your mortal existence with your sort of immortal soul. And she was a bit of an eccentric person, but one day she told me that she had met me in a past life, right? And I wasn't really sure if I believed her or not, but over time she convinced me to do a sort of past life regression trance. And I finally said yes. I was a little apprehensive because of other experiences, like in that hotel room. They were very traumatic. So it's not something you just go into, very excited about. So eventually I said yes. And, I've done a lot of meditation, so it wasn't too difficult for me to get into a trance. After I got into the trance, she started sort of reciting a script to get me to go back. And after a time, I did go back. And I was in London, and the year was 1754. And I was a street kid trying to survive in London. and I was starving, and people were like beating me, and it was very, very, a very, very traumatic experience, because even though I was in the trance, I was sort of feeling it, almost reliving it in some ways, not completely, but almost as if I was detached from this person, like connected to them, and sort of watching from outside, but still sort of feeling their pain. And it just showed me like this really short life of just complete struggle and destitution, and then just death. Somebody like a store owner or somebody beat this person to death, and I assume it was me, but you know, there's no way to prove it. I woke from the trance, and obviously, like, a wave of emotion came over me, and I cried, and it was really intense. But having done it, it's not that I regret it, but I think that there's so much more to this idea of anamnesis that maybe we might just learn a little tip of it by the end of our lives. And unfortunately, when we die, we're going to forget everything again. So there's a little bit of a futile nature to that. But I would say, if you want some kind of self-wisdom, I definitely think it's something to experience. And the problem is, I don't think you can really, it's not that easy to just force yourself to experience it. I think it happens, in traumatic instances, or, altered states. Maybe if you were on hallucinogenic mushrooms or something, maybe you could tap into it. But I definitely think it's life-changing. Anyway, I will probably talk more about it in other videos, or at least touch on it. And if you want to check out the whole story of my experience with it, you can check out my book, and the link's in the description. Have a good day. Take care.